I've got right at 11, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of get started with some introductions and welcome everyone to our last Cattle Over Coffee webinar series for the summer. I think these have been pretty successful, so I think this is something that'll probably stay on our radar, and we'll maybe try to do something like this in the fall. So if you've been on any of these and you've had some ideas of something else that you'd like to see, that might be relevant to something this fall or this summer, we can expand on any of the topics we've talked about so far. Be sure to let Libby or I know. For those of y'all that are registered for this meeting, you'll receive a link to the recording. You can also find there's a playlist on our YouTube channel that has all of the Cattle Over Coffee webinar videos from this summer. We've covered economics, forages, cattle health, and now nutrition. So those will all be available for you to go back and watch after the fact. And then if you follow us on social media, you'll notice we've pulled, and I say we very loosely, Libby has done a really nice job of putting together some reels of kind of some snapshots of some of the content from these Cattle Over Coffee webinars. You'll see there's one from Dr. Maples, and there'll be some coming from Dr. Lemus and Dr. Jumpers as well. So those are good little minute and a half videos that kind of give the highlights of those talks. So those will be on our Facebook and Instagram pages. You can view those and feel free to share those after the fact. Kind of in the sake of time, I will go ahead and get us kicked off for today. I guess I get to introduce myself because I'll be visiting with y'all about beef cattle nutrition tips in today's Cattle Over Coffee webinar. For those of y'all that don't know, although I kind of fall into a jack of all trades as the state beef cattle extension specialist, my training and my background is really in nutrition. So that's the kind of questions I like answering, I like delving into from a research standpoint. There we go. So we kind of want to start off with some just big picture considerations for nutrition. One of the things that I always try to encourage producers, nutrition can get pretty complicated pretty fast whenever you start diving into all the different things that cows can eat, that they can utilize, and there's a lot of moving parts and pieces. I encourage you keep it simple. More ingredients doesn't mean a ration is better. Often a simpler ration can fit your needs as a producer, not just your cattle's needs, and fit a lot better for your farm as well as your pocketbook. So more complicated doesn't equal better from a nutrition standpoint. And then the other thing I always like to hammer home is knowledge is power. Y'all all remember that the more you know graphic from back in the day, like the Reading Rainbow. I think that applies very well when we talk about nutrition. The more you know about your cattle, about the feed and the hay in particular, that you want to feed those cattle, know your farm. And along with that, know your limits. So if you've got 20 head of cows, like most cattle producers do, you're a small farmer, you're not probably set up to receive truckloads of 5 different ingredients and mix up a ration like you would on, say, 100,000 head feedlot. You might have a job off the farm that might mean it's a little bit more difficult, and you got to think of some different things when it comes to getting that nutrition to your cow herd or feeding those calves that you might have on feed after weaning. Know your limits. It's really easy to get burnt out, particularly in the winter when it's cold and it hurts to go outside and you've got to feed hay and get bogged down in mud and lots of other things going on. So I think it's important to know your limits and know how to work within those limits. So we'll start off kind of talking about knowing your cattle. To know your cattle, I think it's important to consider the nutrient requirements of those cattle. So there's some tables out there that'll give you kind of the best guess of what your animal's needs. Their nutrient requirements are going to be based on animal type. So a mature cow is going to have different nutrient requirements than, say, a 400-pound calf or a yearling or a finishing steer as compared to a bull. That yearling or that growing calf is going to have different nutrient requirements based on how fast we're expecting that calf to grow. That cow is going to have different nutrient requirements based on what stage of production she's in. If she's lactating in peak lactation, her requirements are going to be very different from right after she's weaned a calf. And she's just pregnant and growing that next calf in her belly. And so we'll start off kind of looking at what that looks like over time and how that's going to change over time. So this chart gives you the energy requirements for an Angus beef cow throughout her annual production cycle. So you can see we start at calving. That's kind of our month 0. That's that first line on the graph. And you'll notice her greatest energy requirements are going to come at peak lactation. And we'll get into kind of how that's split up on the next slide a little bit. But just know, right after she calves, about the time we're expecting her to get rebred for that next calf, that's when her energy requirements are going to be at their peak. And you'll notice kind of as we work along through that production cycle, as she gets closer to weaning that calf, you'll see those requirements are going to start to drop off. That calf's eating a little more grass, foraging for itself a little bit more, maybe getting a little bit of creek feed. So she's producing less milk. We wean that calf, and you'll see a pretty drastic drop off in terms of her requirements for lactation. She's not producing milk anymore. So that lactation requirement's going to go away. The green dotted line that you see going across the bottom is what that cow just requires to maintain herself, kind of status quo as she is now. And then you'll notice as she gets close to calving for that next calf, the 3rd trimester is when that calf's doing the most growing. So we've got some requirements for gestation as well for growing that next calf. So you can see even for that mature cow, her requirements aren't going to be the same for during that course of that production cycle. This is a graph that I like because it kind of shows you a little bit how things are split up. About 60% of her energy requirements are going just towards maintenance. So if you think about it, 60% of the energy consumed that she's going to eat is going to go just towards maintaining herself as she is. If she's not meeting that maintenance requirement, we're going to start pulling off those fat stores that we can measure from her body condition score. So that's one of the reasons why we always suggest that that cow is at a body condition score of 5 to 6. If we're talking about a first calf heifer, we want her to be a body condition score of 6 when she calves, so that she's got some energy to pull off of from that reserve. You'll see that about 30% of those requirements are going to be made up of lactation. So her energy that's going to go into producing that milk for that calf. And you can see it's going to peak a couple of months right after she calves when she's producing more of that milk. And then you'll notice as she gets in that last trimester of pregnancy, about 10% of her requirements are going to go towards gestation and producing that next calf. Just to kind of hammer it home one more time, you'll see this is the energy required, and we've got breeding plugged in about 3 months after calving. That black line I want you to pay attention to because that is going to be her total energy requirements. So you'll notice they're going to be the highest really at that point where we're trying to get her rebred for that next calf. So that's really a critical time in terms of nutrition and providing the things that that cow is going to need. We definitely don't want to skimp those months after she calves if we want her to raise a big calf, produce a lot of milk, and then get rebred for the next year. So where do you find these requirements? There's a lot of research that's gone into this group, to those beef cattle requirements. A group called the National Research Council updates the nutrient requirements for all livestock species kind of on an as needed basis. The most recent beef cattle edition is from 2016, so we're probably due for an update here pretty soon. Those usually, depending on updates and knowledge and whatnot, will happen about every 8 to 10 years. You'll see that abbreviated as NASEM. That's the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. We also have an extension publication that has those split out in terms of nutrient requirements for beef cattle that you can look at on our extension website. So just to give you an idea of kind of some of the numbers. So I mentioned that cows' requirements are going to change based on her stage of production, but they're also going to change based on how big that cow is. Not surprisingly, a bigger cow is going to have greater nutrient requirements. So the bars that I have in red here, those two rows that I have in red, are both 7 months after calving. So this is a dry cow kind of approaching her last trimester of gestation. So this is the point where her requirements are going to be at their lowest. So she's not producing milk for that next calf or for that calf on her side anymore because that calf's weaned, most likely just been weaned. And she's not hit that last trimester of gestation yet to start really amping up growing that next calf. What you really want to pay attention to is the daily nutrients required per animal. So that'd be the last two columns on here. So we've got TDN, that stands for total digestible nutrients in pounds per day that's required, and crude protein, so that's the CP, in pounds per day that's required. So you'll notice just by bumping up 200 pounds, we go from a TDN required of 9.1 pounds per day for that 1,000-pound cow to 10.5 pounds per day for that 1,200-pound cow. This is not me advocating for small cows. This is just realizing that bigger cows are going to require more input and more resources from an energy and protein standpoint. If we take those same two cows and throw them into peak lactation, so we went to the second month after calving. Both of these cows have had calves. Our TDN requirements for that 1,000-pound cow went from about 9 pounds all the way up to 15 pounds per day. So we see a pretty big increase in terms of energy and protein required when we tack on that lactation component. Just to kind of talk a little bit more about nutrition and stage of production and why it's so vital. If we think about it from a calf growth standpoint, that red line is going to be the weight in pounds, and how you'll see it's pretty dramatically going to increase during that last trimester of gestation. That's when that calf's going to do the most growing in that last trimester, and you'll see a pretty exponential increase in terms of calf size not long after weaning. So that's when that calf's doing the most growth, but there's a lot of stuff that's happening early on while that calf's in utero. So that bottom line is going to be from conception to the time when that calf's born, and the months that some things are going to happen. So you'll notice that if we restrict nutrients from about month 2 to month 7, we're going to see a decrease in muscle fiber and muscle mass in offspring, because that's the period of time when myogenesis is going to occur. So we're building that muscle fiber and that muscle tissue of that calf during that point of time. If we're restricting that cow and she's not providing enough nutrients to that calf during late gestation, so that yellow section at the top, adipogenesis, so that means fat, adipose tissue development, nutrient restriction during that time is actually going to decrease marbling in those offspring when they get the feedlot. So we're talking about affecting carcass quality of a calf before it's even born. And that can have a pretty big impact because we know quality is going to sell. We can also see that if we're restricting nutrients to that cow during that last trimester, we'll see decreased birth weight during that last trimester because we're not getting the nutrients to that calf for that calf to grow. So really the point of this is to kind of hammer home nutrition is important throughout the life cycle of that cow and her calf. If we restrict crude protein during gestation, that can have an impact on calf performance. So this is crude protein restricted to the cow while she's pregnant with the calf. Those ones that were just on native pasture, not anything special done to it, less than 7% protein, versus cows that were on a higher quality pasture, 9% protein. We saw lighter weaning weights in those calves, that their dams didn't receive as much protein while they were carrying that calf. Those calves were lighter at slaughter and had lighter carcass weights. So we're talking about a year and a half to 2 years after that nutrient restriction had occurred on that cow, and it's affecting that calf a couple years out. So that really kind of hammers home that point, I think, to pay attention to nutrients all throughout and making sure we're providing the nutrients that cow needs throughout that production cycle. So we'll talk about a little bit about replacement heifers, and we could have a whole talk and a whole topic where we're talking about nutritional development of replacement heifers. But just know there's not a one size fits all. So you're looking at the results from a study where we fed heifers to gain at a low, medium, or high average daily gain. So low target average daily gain is the black line. The blue line is kind of a medium target average daily gain. And the red line is that high target average daily gain. So you can see they separate pretty nicely from a body weight standpoint towards the end of the experiment. I really want y'all to focus on that bottom graph. So you can see that there's a pretty big difference in the percent of those heifers that reach puberty by the end of that experiment. So we targeted the end of this experiment to be about the time of breeding for these heifers. So those heifers that were targeted to a low average daily gain, only about 50% of those heifers reached puberty by the end of the experiment. So those heifers only gained about 0.88 pounds per day. The medium ones gained about 1.32, and the high ones gained 1.76 pounds per day. So that's not exponential or really high in terms of average daily gain. We didn't push any of these heifers very hard, but we saw that accelerated body weight gain post-weaning advanced puberty onset. And they actually followed these heifers through that first calf and looked at milk production on these girls, and there was no difference in milk yield. So there's always the argument that if we push those heifers too hard during development, we can start impacting the mammary tissue and maybe lay in some fat in that mammary tissue on those heifers. But following these heifers through that first calf, we looked at milk yield, fat corrected milk, and energy corrected milk. And we saw there's no statistical differences in milk yield between these three production groups, although it does look slightly like we had a little bit lower milk yield in the low average daily gain heifers. So some food for thought when it comes to replacement heifer development. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about kind of some pasture and forage conditions and maybe some considerations as well. So I pulled up the drought map for Mississippi yesterday. So the most recent version of this would have come out last Thursday. So you can see there are some chunks of Mississippi, particularly on the northeast side of the state. I think that chunk of red in a D3 extreme drought is actually in Lowndes County. Northern Lowndes County, you can see there's some chunks that are in D1, even D2 drought. So that's concerning for a lot of producers when we start thinking about what the drought monitor, the drought map looked like last fall. Last fall was pretty bad for the state of Mississippi. We saw a good chunk of the state was experiencing exceptional drought. D4, D3 covered most of the state. The entire state was in some level of drought below average rainfall. It usually rains a lot here in Mississippi, so we rely on that rainfall to go grow grass. Grass is going to be, that forage is going to be the primary source of nutrition for most of our cattle throughout most of their productive lives, either from a cow's grazing standpoint, or a hay production standpoint. So last year we saw that a lot of our producers, not only typically we maybe would have seen had low quality hay, they didn't have any hay available. So we got a lot of phone calls of producers that were looking for hay replacement options, hay alternative options. And there were also a lot of cows that got sold in Mississippi last year. So Dr. Lemus in his talk about a month ago made some comments and talked a little bit about drought recovery. And I think a lot of our state is still working on drought recovery. So it's pretty concerning when we see that last slide. Thankfully, it's been raining in Starkville. I don't know how it is in your part of the state, but we've been getting kind of little snippets of rain, but it's still awfully dry and we still definitely could use some more. I encourage you, no matter how much hay you have, no matter what hay you have available to those cows, most of us, that's our primary source of nutrition for our cows, primarily what they're eating in the winter months. We've all got kind of a time in between, maybe if you're in fescue country in the northern part of the state, where fescue kind of plays out and maybe our ryegrass hasn't come back up, or maybe you're in the southern part of the state and fescue is not a thing for you. So you're waiting on your ryegrass to hopefully get some rain and to hopefully come up. So you're relying on some hay. I encourage you, and I know there's several of y'all that are extension agents on here. I encourage you to get familiar with submitting hay samples because there's a lot of valuable information that we can get from that. I always hear from producers, well, they got to eat the hay no matter what, right? Why does it matter what I send out for them, whether I know what it is, what quality it is or not? Well, it matters because we can use that hay quality and that hay analysis to be able to adjust our supplementation plan. Even though this hay that I've got in this slide is pretty low quality, so if you look in the dry matter column that I've got circled there, it's a little below 6% protein and it's about 56% TDN. We'd consider that a pretty poor quality grass hay. But I know I can feed those cows a little extra protein and energy to kind of go along with that hay for them to be able to utilize it better. And it can still be a source of nutrition for those cows to get through the winter months. So I encourage you, always start with knowledge. Going back to that first slide, always start with knowledge and know what you're feeding to those cows so that we can make a better plan to be able to supplement those cows. And don't think or be embarrassed of, well, my hay doesn't stack up very well. We used to have a partnership. LSU had a forage lab that did a really nice job testing hay samples. We had a cooperative agreement where we sent all of our samples from Mississippi to that lab. So from 2006 to 2014, we looked at all the samples that were sent from Mississippi that were sent to that lab. And we saw a good chunk of them are below what those cows needs. So you can see our annual ryegrass would typically be about 10% protein, 57% TDN. Most producers are feeding a Bermuda grass or a mixed grass type hay. That would be about 9 to 10% protein, 51 to 54% TDN. And you can see that our highest quality category is going to be our silage or our baleage because we've got that little bit of added nutrients from a fermentation standpoint. I will throw a caution into this. Typically the samples that are sent in are from producers that think they're doing a really good job putting up hay. So I would almost argue that this data is almost a little bit skewed. So if we threw all the hay in Mississippi into a pot and sent it off, we'd probably actually looking at a little bit lower quality than this. It's not unusual to see 6 to 7% warm season grass hay in terms of a protein standpoint and around 52 to 55% TDN. So what does that mean from meeting those cows' needs? So this chart shows the percent of samples in each forage category that does not meet the nutrient requirements for crude protein and TDN for that small beef cow. So that 1,000-pound beef cow, with her nutrient requirement being 7% protein and 45% TDN. So you can see most of them did okay from a TDN standpoint, but I'll throw some caution into that. Most people don't have 1,000-pound cows. So your cow's nutrient requirements for energy are actually probably going to be a little bit higher. And you can see a good chunk of these forage samples from a mixed grass, Bermuda grass, or Bahia grass standpoint still didn't meet the protein requirements of this small 1,000-pound cow. So some food for thought, considering thinking about how your hay is going to stack up that you're going to be feeding those cows through the winter months. Lastly, wouldn't be a good nutrition tips overview talk if we didn't talk about minerals. Minerals and vitamins are going to account for a very small portion of intake in beef cattle diets. And a lot of times they can be overlooked in a nutritional program, and kind of a lot of producers will consider them an afterthought almost. It's important to note that most everything is going to be affected by our mineral program. Growth and performance could be compromised, reproduction could be compromised if those cows aren't receiving the minerals and vitamins that they need. So macro and micro minerals are how we often refer to things. Macro doesn't mean that they're more important. Macro just means that they're required in a larger quantity. So our macro minerals would be things like calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, chloride or chlorine, and sulfur. These are usually required in grams per day, and we'll a lot of times see these requirements expressed in a percent of a diet. Our micro minerals are oftentimes referred to as trace minerals. These would be things like chromium, cobalt, copper, iodine, iron, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, selenium, and zinc. And these are going to be required in milligrams or micrograms per day. So a lot of times you'll see these expressed as a parts per million on a label. So they're going to be required in really small amounts when we're thinking about what those cows actually need from a micro mineral standpoint. Calcium and phosphorus are talked about a lot in beef cattle diets. Just to give you kind of a general lay of that land, forages are typically high in calcium and low in phosphorus, particularly at the end of the growing season. And our grain-based feeds or concentrate feeds are kind of the reverse. They're going to be low in calcium and high in phosphorus. We talk a lot about calcium to phosphorus ratio and maintaining that, because when we get those skewed, we can start having some imbalance issues. So ideally, we'd shoot for about a 1.5 to 1.6 to 1 calcium to phosphorus ratio. But 1 to 1 or 2 to 1 would fall in what we call the acceptable range. A lot of times we'll supplement calcium by adding limestone to beef cattle diets. So a lot of times if we're formulating, like say, a feedlot diet that's really grain based, we'd use limestone to increase the calcium level of that diet because corn would be really low in calcium. And that limestone's about 34% calcium. Dicalcium phosphate's another option that can kind of help balance those things. It's about 22% calcium and 19% phosphorus, and that'll a lot of times get added into a complete mixed ration. Most producers, though, are going to be dealing with a complete mineral supplement, whether it be in a form of a loose mineral or a tub or something along those lines. So we'll talk more about those, I think, in a couple of slides in terms of mineral feeding. Some mineral imbalances to watch out for. Grass tetany is one we hear a lot during ryegrass season. Grass tetany is actually a magnesium deficiency, and you'll see it neurological problems. Well, those cows will kind of appear to start stumbling around. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of producers will feed a high mag or high magnesium mineral when those cattle are out grazing ryegrass. We can see some issues with urinary calculi. It's also known as water belly. So basically kind of stones will build up. This can particularly be a problem, probably more so in steers than in heifers, and it's caused by high phosphorus relative to calcium. Polioencephalomalacia is a mouthful, a big word. But basically, a high sulfur diet will disrupt thiamine metabolism. So they'll kind of look like brainers. I've seen some issues with this, not because of any one source in the animal's diet will have high sulfur, but a lot of times it'll be a combination of sources. So in some parts of the state, we might have high sulfur in some of our water sources. So combine that with feeding, say, a distiller's grain that could potentially have a lot of sulfur as well. And those two combined can equal a higher sulfur level that can cause that disruption of thiamine metabolism, and then we get polio. White muscle disease would be something that we would see in calves. It's a selenium deficiency that's going to impair calf mobility. And then milk fever would be something that we see more in dairy cows, but can happen in high producing beef cows as well. They mobilize a lot of calcium to go towards milk production right after they calve, and we'll see those cows go down after calving. This will be one where it's really important to have a good relationship with your veterinarian, because if those cows are treated right away, it's easy for them to bounce back from that. A few tips on mineral feeding. Provide a good mineral supplement year round. I think it's something that is key. If you're noticing that those cows are hitting that mineral really hard, eating that mineral really hard, a couple of things. Don't let that mineral run out. So if those cows get used to only having mineral, a few times and the mineral is constantly running out, they're going to overeat it to kind of balance out that consumption. Another consideration is considering the location of that mineral. A lot of times I'll talk to producers, and from a convenience standpoint, we drive in the gate, we put the mineral feeder down, we've got a water trough right there, and in the wintertime, we're probably feeding hay pretty close to the gate if possible. So we basically created an all-you-can-eat buffet for those cows. So if we notice that those cows are overeating on mineral, we can move that mineral away from water and shade. So it's not in a loafing area. They kind of have to go to it. Conversely, if those cows aren't eating enough mineral, I usually suggest putting it closer to that water source or that loafing area as well. I encourage you to read your tag on your mineral. A lot of the minerals that are sold in our part of the country particularly are sold as complete minerals, meaning they already contain salt. And you don't need to add additional salt because you can throw off the balance of those minerals. Offering salt separately, those cattle crave salt. So a lot of times they'll go to that salt and consume salt first and may not also consume the mineral that is containing salt as well. I mentioned if they're not eating enough, you can move it closer and change the location. There's some minerals that don't taste very well. So magnesium is one that doesn't taste very well. So a lot of cows don't like to eat high mag mineral. So maybe considering changing up that mix if you notice they're just not eating it. Making sure you are checking those mineral feeders and keeping a record of how often you're putting out mineral to track consumption is something that I think is really important. That first bullet point is one that causes some heartburn for a lot of people, but those red trace mineral salt blocks, the key word in those are salt. They're going to contain mostly salt in those trace mineral salt blocks, and there's minimal mineral content in those. So I suggest getting a good quality loose mineral, or maybe you're in a situation where you're weaning calves or receiving period, you want to make sure they're eating it. They make some mineral tubs that are molasses based to encourage intake on those as well. Making sure you're paying attention to the feeders and the location, protecting that mineral from wind and rain, to pay attention to hardening and caking of those. If you notice, a lot of minerals that are available on the market will be weatherized. So they can get rained on and get wet and they'll kind of clump up, but then you can kind of break them up when you check that mineral supply to make sure it's not running out. Making sure you've got an adequate number of feeders. So we had a mineral feeder a couple of slides ago, those 3 compartment covered ones. Those are great, but make sure that you have enough out there for the number ahead. Say if you're running really large groups, really large pastures, there might not be enough out there based on the stocking rate that you're looking at out in those pastures. We usually don't focus on vitamins very much in beef cattle diets because usually they're not a problem on lush pasture. Vitamins A, D, and E will be added sometimes. Vitamin A is the one vitamin that's most likely to be deficient in beef cattle diets. They get vitamin D from the sun. Most of our cows live outside, right? We've seen some benefits to supplementing vitamin E in particularly stressed calves. So say around weaning time. We usually don't typically have to supplement B vitamins because they're produced by the microbes in the rumen. It's important to note that these vitamins could degrade over time. So don't store more than a 3-month supply at a time when you're thinking about vitamins and minerals. I will say kind of one last comment on minerals. Good minerals typically aren't cheap, and cheap minerals typically aren't good. So you really get what you pay for when you start talking about mineral supplements. So consider that in terms of value, not cost. Typically, a more expensive mineral is going to be more bioavailable to that animal. So you can think about that in terms of a balance from a budget and an economic standpoint. Just kind of wrapping things up from a few points to kind of hammer home before we open things up for questions. There's not a one-size-fits-all scenario when it comes to nutrition or nutrient management for your cow herd. Feeding cattle is dynamic. I often tell people the cow didn't read that textbook. The rumen is a wondrous thing. That means cows can utilize a wide variety of feedstuffs, and there's not one best feed for a cow. We usually try to utilize forage as much as possible, make them go out and harvest their own nutrition. If you haven't listened to Dr. Lemus's talk about pasture management, I encourage you to do that because being a grass farmer and making sure we're producing high quality forages for those animals, I think is something that's really important. Try to feed your hay and your supplements as efficiently as possible. One of the ways that we can do that is by knowing the quality of that hay that we're feeding to those animals in the winter months. Paying attention to when forage, maybe if we're talking about standing forage, is getting too mature. As that forage is going to get more mature, the nutrient quality is going to go down in that forage. Don't just price shop the cheapest feed or the cheapest mineral. It's important to consider price, nutrient density, and bioavailability when you're looking at all those things of what's going to fit best for a cow herd. Whenever you get a chance, test that feed and hay, and then don't forget about a good mineral program for the cow herd. And with that, I am happy to open it up for any questions.